Hello and welcome back. We're still talking about corporate moral responsibility. We're going to see another argument from John. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Hasnas, I'm going to guess. Uh, he's also, like Velasquez, is going to argue that corporations are not morally responsible for the things they do, and instead that the moral responsibility falls on the people that constitute the corporation. But he's going to use a slightly different, well, very different technique, right? As we'll see, he thinks the debate has come to sort of a standstill, and we need a new technique. So that's going to be his approach. So the new technique uses a metaphor of the Gordian knot. So this is a legend that Alexander the Great, the Greek general who conquered the entire known world at the time, all of Greece and the Middle East, and I think got as far as India. Uh, he was, in his travels and his various wars, he ended up in the city of Gordium in around 333 BC. And the story goes that in the public square of that city was an enormous knot, very intricately tied, um, and the ends of the knot were also deeply tangled in the knot. So it was difficult, right? Seemingly impossible to undo this knot. And the legend went that anybody who could untie that knot would unite all of Asia under one ruler. So Alexander comes into town, hears about this legend, goes to see the knot, um, you know, tries a little bit, and then comes up with a solution, pulls out his sword, and just slices the knot open. There, I've untied it, right? So that's the story of the Gordian knot. The analogy to corporate responsibility is this. We've seen, well, I haven't subjected you to the entire literature on this, right? But we've seen at least one proposal, from the 70s and early 80s of people saying, well, here's how you should define moral responsibility, and here's why corporations do qualify or they don't qualify. And there's a long back and forth, and the moves are getting even more subtle and more complex. There's not really any consensus um, on the problem, right? So Hasnas says, let's just cut the knot, right? Let's stop arguing about whether corporations satisfy the conditions on moral responsibility, which includes being able to intentionally perform actions and all that stuff. And he says, instead, let's focus on practical consequences. What would happen if we said the corporations were morally responsible? And would we consider those things just and right or not? Um, if if yes, then maybe we should hold corporations morally responsible. If not, then maybe we shouldn't. So I guess it's a sort of utilitarian approach, right? It says, well, if the consequences will be good, then it would be good to hold corporations morally responsible. So just to illustrate how sort of tangled this knot has become of the debate so far, Hasnas summarizes the debate. So we saw French, right, who proposed two conditions on moral responsibility. You need, for something to be morally responsible, it needs to be the cause of the event, and that's bad, the cause of the harm, and also has to have intended to bring the event about, right? And French argues that corporations satisfy both conditions in virtue of their corporate internal decision structure, right? So they have this sort of structure that is enough to say this corporation made a decision and did it intentionally. Um, then we saw Velasquez argue that no, corporations are not the source of things that can form intentions and act, um, since they don't have bodies and they don't have the right kinds of minds that humans have. Uh, they can't be morally responsible. So the debate went on for decades, right? So others, Keeley, Ladd, um, have argued that corporations can't form intentions. At best they can employ sort of means ends reasoning. What that means is, you can uh, whatever you can figure out your best route to work or to class, right? That's sort of means ends reasoning. Um, but corporations can't think morally. They can't deliberate on the morality of actions, right? So if they have any sort of intentionality, it may be at the level of sort of a bug or something, right? They can figure out quickest way to the food and back, but they're not going to. Corporations don't have the kinds of minds that could deliberate about morality, right? Um, and others have replied, sure, okay, they're not maybe complete moral persons in that sense, but corporations can be morally responsible, um, arguing that all you really need to be morally responsible is to be able to produce the reasons for the behavior. And it seems like a corporation could do that. If you ask Exxon, send an email to the Exxon info uh, box, hey, why did you do this thing? You could conceivably get an email back that explained the reasons, right? But there is just in general disagreement on whether the use of intention or reason can apply to non-humans in more than a purely metaphorical way. I've suggested that, I mean, what you need at this point is a fleshed out philosophy of mind, right? So again, the question of whether a corporation um, qualifies as having mental states like intentions depends on, the nature of mental states. And there's all kinds of different theories of the nature of mental states. I think according to functionalism, um, yeah, anything, a computer, an alien, a robot, or maybe even a corporation, so long as it has parts that play the right functional roles, that take certain inputs and produce certain behaviors, um, could count as a mind according to functionalism, right? So that if you're a functionalist about mind, it seems like there's no problem with corporations forming intentions and being morally responsible, but not everyone's a functionalist. So, other people like John Searle and seemingly Velasquez as well, although he's not as explicit, think that no, what makes something mental uh, is that it could be conscious, right? And certainly corporations are not conscious, right? So they wouldn't qualify as having mental states on that criterion. So um, it's not that this debate is can't be solved, right? But it does seem to bottom out in a really difficult question about the nature of the mind. So, Hasnas wants to approach things differently. So he says, first of all, we should consider whether we're just dealing with a category mistake here, right? So before we ask whether corporations can satisfy the necessary and sufficient conditions for moral responsibility, we should ask whether they're even the right types of things that we could say are morally responsible. So what I mean is, um, if you were to ask me, hey, is justice blue? I would say that question doesn't even make sense, right? Justice is not the sort of thing that can be blue. This is what we call a category mistake. You're trying to apply color to an entity that can't have a color, right? And so when we talk about corporate moral responsibility, we're extending something. It makes sense, for example, to ask whether uh, an insane person can be morally responsible, because persons are usually the types of things we attribute moral responsibility to. And I'm asking, well, when a person has, this sort of characteristic, can we still apply moral responsibility? Um, Jumping to corporations, right, is a bigger leap, and it might just be a category mistake, right? There's certainly much more abstract collections of people than like, here's Brad Pitt in the film 12 Monkeys. If you've never seen it, it's a sci-fi movie about time travel. It's great, but he plays a mentally ill, a mental patient, right? Um, so yeah, we can ask, is Brad Pitt in this film morally responsible for the things he does? But to ask whether a corporation is, it might not even be the right kind of question, right? Take the White House, right? The reporters and stuff will say, the White House issued a message today about the tariffs or whatever. Um, what are they referring to? It's a sort of a collection of people who counts as a member of the White House, certainly the president, but not Congress, but probably the president's secretary is part of the White House. It's kind of hard to pick out exactly what it refers to, right? So then to say the White House is morally responsible for something, does that even make sense? So things like, the White House, the New York Knicks, Exxon, they all refer to indefinite collections of people, right? Again, you can ask, does the president's secretaries, do they count as a part of the White House or not, right? It's indefinite. It's not clear. It's a group of people that is the White House. They're not just talking about the building, right? But it's not clear who's in and who's out. But nonetheless, we talk that way. We'll say things like Congress is responsible for the deficit, right? But the question is, Is this just a metaphor? We speak metaphorically all the time, and often we know when we're not being serious, or I can say Santa wears a red hat, right? But obviously, I'm not trying to refer to something that actually exists, right? So we do this all the time in the English language. So the job of philosophers sometimes is to figure out, well, what do we really mean by our language? Are we really committing to the existence of a special thing called the White House that's not the building, and it's not the president, it's not just a group of people, right? Um, so these are the sort, I mean, Velasquez doesn't really want to fall into this trap either, right? Of trying to figure out whether the White House exists and what sort of thing the White House is, or what sort of thing a corporation is. Um, Instead, he wants to focus on the practical effects of taking one of the two positions. Either corporations are morally responsible or they aren't. Um, okay, let's suppose we can, right? What would follow from that? Or suppose we can't, what would follow from that? And then he's going to try to uh, pick the one that has the best consequences. So, what would the consequences be? Well, first, the obvious thing is if we ascribe moral responsibility to a corporation, then we could punish a corporation as a collective entity, right? And that punishment would be distinct from any punishment we might inflict on members of the corporation, right? So you could punish the CEO of Exxon, but then you could also punish Exxon itself as a corporation, right? Um, if we decided that corporations aren't morally responsible and they're not the sort of things we can punish, we could still punish the members, right? We could still punish the CEO or whichever person we could ascribe the wrongdoing to. So whether or not we hold corporations morally responsible, that won't change any of that. There will still be punishment. People will still get punished. The question is, can we do extra punishment on top of it? Um, Another thing that won't change if we hold corporations morally responsible is that the fines and the other sorts of restitution corporations will have to pay. So that's because an obligation to pay restitution doesn't actually depend on your being morally responsible for something, right? Um, Again, your insurance company may pay restitution to somebody. If you have liability insurance and you harm someone, but you have insurance for that, then the insurance company will pay the restitution. The insurance company isn't morally responsible, right? Same with corporations. Or suppose you found a stolen bike, right? Well, you're going to have to return that bike to the owner. You can't just keep it, right? Now, you're not morally responsible for the bike being stolen, but you still have to pay the bike back, right? And even in our current legal system, corporations often pay damages even when they're not, strictly speaking, responsible, right? So the corporation may actually, have done everything according to the law, and something still bad still happened, sort of by accident or as, and nonetheless, often they'll have to pay restitution just as a general incentive to make companies more aware and more proactive in preventing harm. So again, even if we decide that corporations aren't the sorts of things that could be morally responsible, they'll still have to pay restitution when harms happen, right? That's independent of the moral question. Now, typically, you can only blame someone for something if they're morally responsible, right? And this is true, but Hasnas argues this won't stop people from um, blaming corporations sort of rhetorically, right? So even if we decide, well, Exxon can't be morally responsible for an oil spill, people will still protest, right? And they will still have signs that say Exxon is a bad corporation, right? They will still blame Exxon. And even if, I mean, a philosopher can come by and say, strictly speaking, that's false, right? They're not the sort of thing you can blame. It's not going to stop that practice. And if we find any benefit in that practice of raising public awareness or whatever, that's going to keep happening, right? People are going to keep blaming, even if we decide that they probably technically shouldn't, right? Um, you know, Try to convince them to instead hold signs that say, no, this list of executives is bad, right? Well, that's not rhetorically very useful, right, in a political, protest or whatever. So uh, people are going to keep blaming. We might also, one of the things we'd like to encourage is a corporate culture of, uh, being safe and careful and environmentally responsible and all these things. And Hasnas argues that that's not going to change either, even if we decided that corporations can't be morally responsible. Um, the general effort to direct corporate culture into a moral direction can be done whether or not corporations themselves uh, can be assigned moral responsibility. So, as an example of what I even mean by corporate culture, so Enron, which you may have heard of, this is in the news, I guess, quite a while ago now, but it was a company that was convicted of all sorts of wrongdoing, right? And it was a stock traders were a part of the company, and they had this culture where you were rated on the amount of profit you made, and if you were towards the bottom of the list, you got fired, right? Rank and yank, they called it. Well, what that created in the company was a culture of like, I need to make profit, right? Regardless of the legality or the morality, right? And that's been cited as one of the causes of Enron's criminal activity. So you can promote a good corporate culture whether or not the corporation itself can be punished, right? Because still, the members of the corporation can still be punished, and that's bad enough, right? Or maybe you would just like your people of the corporation to act morally, right? That's a novel concept, right? So in all these cases with the blaming and the corporate culture, talk of moral responsibility, um, even if it turns out that corporations aren't the sorts of things that can be morally responsible, is fine. It's a sort of shorthand, right? Instead of listing every single uh, CEO or every single executive of the corporation. Um, and that's fine. People will still talk like that. It's still fine to talk like that. We talk metaphorically all the time. We'll say things like Exxon is bad, even if strictly speaking, you can't say Exxon is bad, right? Even if strictly speaking, that's a category mistake. So the main practice, right, that was a long list of things that won't change, right? The consequences that won't really matter. So back to the main thing that will change, right? If we decide corporations are morally responsible, is that we can punish the corporation in addition to to the humans, right? Um, so punishment, right, is an infliction of harm in response to some moral transgression, right? It's a sort of a special carve out for harm. Typically, harming other people is wrong, but when it's punishment, we're allowed to harm, right? Um, in an ideal world, criminal punishment would follow from moral punishment, right? The moral and the legal, they're not going to perfectly overlap, but it certainly should be legal to do moral things, and maybe not every immoral thing ought to be illegal, right? If, cheating on your boyfriend or girlfriend is immoral, maybe that doesn't need to be illegal, right? But in general, criminal punishment should only be inflicted on the types of things that are moral agents, right? That's why we don't convict babies or dogs or the mentally incompetent. Um, in the same way as we prosecute rational adults, right? So moral responsibility is a necessary condition on criminal responsibility. So can we uh, criminally prosecute corporations, right? Well, if we can, we should only be able to if they are considered moral agents, right? So again, but we're only considering the consequences, right? So what happens if you do that? If you consider a corporation to be a moral agent and then in, conclude that you can start punishing them, independently of the people. So here's an example, right, of that distinction. So another company was dealing with Enron and doing shady things. The company was called Arthur Andersen, and David Duncan was an employee at Arthur Andersen who was um, the liaison with Enron, and he was convicted of doing illegal stuff, right? Okay, so he was convicted, he was fined, but it didn't crash the Arthur Andersen company, right? It was one of their employees got in trouble, right? But then later there was a criminal judgment against the company itself, and that did kill the company. Worldwide, 85,000 people lost their jobs, right? Um, so maybe you say, yay, right? Justice has been done, right? Um, but arguable, Hasnas will say no. So, but the point is, right? If we can prosecute corporations, right, themselves because we find them morally responsible, you can really do a lot more damage, right, to the corporation, um, which might seem like a good thing, right? But Hasnas argues, no, that's actually a bad thing and it's unjust. So why? Why would punishing a corporation itself, in addition to the members, be unjust? He says, first of all, um, corporations themselves can't suffer, right? They are whatever kind of entities they are, functional entities or maybe just fictions. They're not going to feel pain, right? They're not going to go to jail. They're not going to worry about whether their kids can be fed. Um, any suffering that happens is going to fall entirely on the humans that are in some relation to the company, right? And there's a wide number of humans that are in some relation to the company. There's customers of the company, there's employees, there's investors, right? So secondly, whatever penalty you inflict on the corporation, it's going to be a financial one. Again, you can't put the company in jail, you can't flog them or give them the death penalty. I mean, there's metaphorically, you could give them the death penalty by breaking them up, right? We talked about how the Bell Corporation was broken up into different companies, and you might say, oh, Bell, they killed Bell. But again, that's just a metaphor, right? For the end of a certain revenue stream, right? Or the end of a certain kind of profit, right? You can do other things. You can revoke licenses and stuff, but again, the reason that's bad is because it prevents them from making money. So really, all of the penalties inflicted on a corporation are going to boil down to monetary damages, right? Um, so who suffers from these financial losses? It's going to be humans, right? Um, again, consumers who end up paying higher prices because the company has to make up all this money that it was fined. Some employees might lose jobs because the company has to tighten their belt, and shareholders will lose some or all of their investments. And vast majority of these people who are experiencing these suffering um, are not morally responsible for the wrongdoing, right? So Um, suppose we find Exxon morally responsible for an oil spill, and therefore we prosecute them criminally and right, charge them billions of dollars to clean this thing up. What's going to happen? Well, gas prices are going to go up, right? And so all these customers are going to suffer, right? Even like an investor, right? So you think maybe investors are more responsible, but a lot of us, you have a retirement fund through your job. I have one um, right through the university, and if the university happens to be investing part of that fund in Exxon and the price goes down, okay, then I suffer, right? I didn't ask anybody to invest in Exxon. I didn't, plan to. So it seems like there's a lot of people that did not have any choice or any interest in doing the bad thing that will suffer, right? And, collective punishment of this sort is typically considered a human rights violation when it's in the political sphere, right? So if there's a country, um, and tries to punish a certain ethnic group collectively or something like that, we call that a human rights abuse. So, I mean, Hasnas admits that if you do find corporations morally responsible for their actions and do punish them as separate entities from the people, there will be a deterrent effect, right? So if investors are aware that this sort of thing can happen, they will be much more careful about where they put their money. Employees are going to be much more careful about, where they work and what they do in that company and whether it's immoral or illegal. And if you're a utilitarian, you might like that. You say, well, all that's going to cause better effects, right? If people are only investing their money in companies that they're sure will not do anything illegal or immoral. That would be great. Um, but there's another part of our brains. All of us are kind of half utilitarian, half deontologist. And the deontologist says, yeah, but maybe it'll have good effects, but it's just unfair. It's just unjust, right? Like, sure, we could reduce teenage drinking by punishing the friends of teenage drinkers. That would have a deterrence effect, but like, it's just not fair. It's just not right. And that's what Hasnas thinks. All right. So finally, just one potential objection, right? So someone might say, look, yeah, when someone is punished, other people suffer. That's just the way punishment works, right? If someone is sent to jail, um, their children suffer, even if that person, they did something terrible and they deserve to go to jail. You know, if there's people that depend on them financially, those people are going to suffer. That's just how punishment works sometimes, and that's going to how it will have to work with corporate punishment as well. Hasnas replies to this objection and says, well, look, um, corporate punishment is different, right? The point of putting someone in jail is not to make the children suffer. If you could avoid making the children suffer, you would, right? You just want the criminal to suffer, right? But in corporate punishment, the harm to all the associated people is in fact the point, right? Because it's not, a corporation can't suffer, right? So if we're trying to make someone suffer, it's got to be the people, right? Um, and the punishment of the shareholders, right? So you might say, look, if I invested in a company, they did illegal stuff, and my stock price went up because of the illegal stuff, it's only fair that 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 profit should be taken away from me, right? And I should go back to square one or to zero. Um, but Hasnas argues that the punishment of shareholders actually goes far beyond just the benefit they got from the illegal activity, right? Um, and that's not fair. You shouldn't be totally wiped out, right? Um, if you accidentally bought a stolen bike, the cops are going to take the bike back, right? And that's too bad for you. You're out the amount you paid for the bike, but they shouldn't like take your house too, right? And Hasnas argues that's sort of what happens. That's the sort of punishment that we sometimes inflict on shareholders. Okay, so that is the end of the corporate responsibility section. We'll be moving on to a new unit soon, um, but we'll see you then.